And thanks for coming and joining us this afternoon. My name's James Vitale. I'm Head of Political Economy at Policy Exchange. And today we're going to discuss Labour's plan to get Britain building again. There are many public policy challenges that our country faces, but the housing crisis, and let's be explicit here, the shortage in new housing supply, has a strong and increasingly good claim to being the most important. There's a few things I thought I'd note at the start. One is just, we're in the thick of it at the moment, but it is significant just how much this policy area has found itself at the centre of our political debate. This wasn't the case a year ago. And so the debate has moved a long way in a very short amount of time. For all of us that care about housing policy, that is undoubtedly a good thing. People are becoming increasingly aware not simply of the social costs of dysfunction in the housing market, things like declining home ownership rates, homelessness, etc., but also the economic costs too, and that's something that we've been looking at quite closely at Policy Exchange. The dysfunction in the housing market is not siloed. It has a chilling effect across the economy, and I'm sure that's something that some of the panellists might want to pick up on today. With that said, there is a maddening tendency when it comes to discussions about housing policy to get a room full of people who all agree that we need to build more homes, and just to talk about how much we need to build more homes. And sometimes the concrete, practical policy interventions that are required to do that get a little bit left off. So that's really what I want to focus on today with this fantastic panel we've assembled. I'll introduce you to the panellists first of all. To my right, we have Shyama Tatla. Shyama is councillor for Kingsbury Ward in the London Borough of Brent and was first elected in 2014. She serves as the Cabinet Member for Regeneration, Planning and Growth. To my left, we have Anya Martin, who is the co-director of Priced Out, England's national campaign for affordable housing, and she also works in consumer finance research and is a board member of the London YIMBY Group. And then to Anya's left, we have Brian Berry, if I can find my notes, who's Chief Executive of the Federation of Master Builders, the largest trade association for SME building companies in the industry. And finally, we have, again, if I can find my notes, Sandy Rees-Jones, CBE, who is the president of the Chartered Institute of Building. She began her career in construction, property and engineering as a journalist, working for a variety of technical organisations before forming her management and marketing businesses. You're all very welcome. I'm going to let each of the panellists speak for about 5 minutes about the concrete policy interventions they'd like to see to get this country building again. Then I'll kick off the conversation amongst us with a few questions myself, and then we'll open up to audience questions as quickly as possible. So without any further ado, Sandy, can I invite you to get us going this afternoon?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for attending as we go towards the end of this first day. Chartered Institute of Building, it is an organisation regulated by Royal Charter, and we set and promote standards and the science and practice of construction, essentially construction management. It's a broad church, and it's important to be a broad church because construction is a complicated business. Whether it's houses or infrastructure, there are lots of moving parts and lots of different organisations and people. So to have this joined-up approach and to have a construction management approach is really important. And my presidential theme is collaboration. You just mentioned silos. Silos are one of the big recurring themes in the construction sector. We have professional institutions, we have membership associations, we have contracting organisations, we have specialist subcontractors, we have materials. And for many years, everybody's operated in their own silo, which has given government a wonderful excuse to say, well, we don't really know who to talk to, because there are so many of you and you're so different. And that's changed. And I'm delighted to say that I had a panel earlier today, and today indeed, where we are setting out to work collaboratively with our sister organisations. So we have the Construction Leadership Council, and we're trying to drive forward together because we need to collaborate. Let's look what's on the tin. We're talking about what we need to do to make a difference. We have 3 core themes in our corporate plan at CIOB, which we need to address: sustainability, And that's not simply green sustainability, it's how do we sustain a viable housing supply, how do we sustain a construction industry that will satisfy it. Quality and safety, absolutely essential. This is where we're getting back to our obligation to ensure that everybody who works in and benefits from construction is safe and to a quality that is acceptable. And skills, they're all interlinked, they're all together. So, how do we get Britain building again? We need to address those three core areas, but what we need in a policy sense in order to deliver is certainty, clarity, and consistency. Whether that's on policy, whether it's on funding. We've already seen lots of things disappear in the last few days that we thought we could play in. Housing, essential for everybody. I prefer to call it homes, because otherwise we get caught in this thing about everybody's obsessed by owning a house, which has become one of the problems because it's been seen as an asset you can manipulate. We're concerned about decent homes for all. One of the things we need to talk about is the fact that we have this divided provider of housing. So we have the tier 1 contractors, major housing, large-scale housing, new build. What about the SMEs? And I'm sure Brian will talk about more of that later. But in policy terms, we would like to see a way of helping SME builders build locally on manageable and affordable plots of land to employ people locally, to build communities, and also create a sense of involvement so you get more people coming through the pipeline. But we also need to look at the other huge problem we have, which is the oldest housing stock in Europe. We need a national retrofit strategy, and we need a consistent, funded national retrofit strategy. The single issue solutions failed. Whether it's boilers or insulation, we need that coordinated strategy, and then we need to have in place the way in which it can be realised. We also need to address sustainability, and we are promoting at CIOB the need to recognise and make mandatory embodied carbon values in construction, not just the operating carbon emission issue, which is already in place in Part L. We need a Part Z so that we can really say we're addressing that. It's really important. And skills. We can have certainty, we can have clarity, but if we haven't got people to deliver, then we're not going to get any further. So we are also calling for a skills strategy. In construction, we have two levies. We have the CITB levy and we have the apprenticeship levy, and neither are fit for purpose. So we are calling for a skills levy. We need to find a way of creating a pipeline that will encourage more people into the industry, get properly qualified, and then deliver. And one way of starting that would be to have a built environment, GCSE in schools, so kids begin to understand that it's not a job of last resort, it is something they can do that has value and they can see the career path. That's probably my 4 minutes, James.
Super, that's really interesting things to be getting started with there. Anya, I'm going to ask you to go next, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me and thanks for coming along. I'd like to briefly kind of look at the context of what is happening and why it's so important. Priced Out, we are a campaign group. We represent people who have been priced out of housing. If you haven't rented in the last 10 or 20 years, you might not realise just how dire the situation is. We are one of the worst countries in the OECD for house price increases over the last 30, 40 years. House prices have increased by 400% in real terms, and that compares to an OECD average of 100%. That's not just an interest rate phenomenon, that is a UK-specific issue, and that relates to the supply of housing. Just earlier today, in fact, one of the estate agencies was reporting that they're getting 25 applicants or requests for viewing for each property that they put on the market. And that's up from 20 in the last year. So it's a massive increase, and that has directly contributed to the increase in rents over the last year, which is about 10% across the UK. It is enormous. It is drastically affecting people's lives. It is really quite frightening if you have to look for a house now, because there is so little available on the market, and you're competing with so many people that you're essentially forced to accept whatever terms and conditions you're landed with. So in that context, obviously, we have a supply-demand imbalance. The situation is very dire. We need to build more housing, and we need to do so fast. I'd like to kind of look at a bit of what Labour are saying at the conference and previously to this. I'm kind of cautiously optimistic about it, right? We are hearing a lot of talk about planning, and it's right to focus on that, because I think in the past there has been a bit of magical thinking that you can just increase funding for the Affordable Homes Programme and magically the problem is sorted. But just a simple economic thing, right? If you're putting more money into the system for the same amount of commissioned land, then that is going to increase land prices. And you've got this kind of circular situation where more money is going in and prices keep going up and so on. So it's kind of essentially shoveling it into the fire. It's not to say you shouldn't do that, but you have to also address the supply side of things. So it is good to hear them talking about that and recognising that the bottleneck is really there in permissioned land and not so much on the finance side of things. However, what I would say is I think some of the detail, right, we need to get to grips with. I've been in the housing sector since about 2016, and I remember when I first started as an intern in the social housing sector, one of the things that we kept hearing from every government that came through was, we're going to introduce first dibs for local people, we're going to introduce a mortgage guarantee system, we're going to, starter homes, this and that. And I'm hearing the same things again, and we're going around in circles talking about the same policy ideas that politicians will propose when they come in, and then they'll realise that actually they don't work, or they don't work at the planning stage, or they find out a bit too late after they've implemented that they don't work and they don't fix the problem. So I'm a bit concerned to see these kind of ideas recycling rather than looking at the core structural issue with the market. There has been some very positive stuff. So this idea of a planning bill in the first 100 days of a Labour government, I can understand the haste. I've given myself the reasons for the haste. And much of Labour's spending plans also rely on economic growth as well, and planning is the most obvious way to do that. It's not just a case of housing, but there's also the infrastructure side of things, green energy, industrial space, especially for our life sciences industry. All of that is really going to be helped along by planning reforms. But successive governments have tried to look at this issue, for at least the last 40, 50 years, and they have consistently failed to do so. Rarely are they prepared for the level of pushback that they get from organised and well-funded organisations, and not even the nature of it either. You might expect to have lots of angry local residents kicking off about some development near them, but what a lot of politicians are not prepared for is the fact that often that opposition comes not in the form of angry local residents, but planning consultants and glossy PR firms who are making very sensible sounding arguments for why it's simply not possible to do what every other country in the developed world does, which is build more homes. So on that kind of negative sounding note, as I say, I am cautiously optimistic because they are looking at the right areas, but I think we really need to get into the detail of how that works. Be very brave on that point, but also understand what the opposition is and where it's coming from. And that's it for me.
Thanks very much, Anya. Brian, I'll go to you next, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this invitation to be here this afternoon, and great to be talking about housing. For those of you who are less familiar, the Federation of Master Builders, we're a trade body for small local building companies. We operate all across the UK, so in most villages, towns and cities you will find an FMB member. And we've been committed over the last decade to actually raise standards in the building industry by ensuring that we've got a set of criteria to ensure that master builder companies are the best in the building industry. And I stress that because anyone can call themselves a builder. You don't need any qualifications, you don't need any experience, you can set yourself up as a building company and go out and earn work. And obviously that's a wrong situation and it's very damaging to our industry. So when we talk about standards, that's one issue that I'd like to flag. So let's get back to housing because it's so good. I think this conference is absolutely so positive talking about the role of housing in society because housing is a basic human right, sadly denied to too many people in this country. And the statistics speak for themselves. 1.2 million households waiting on social housing waiting lists. The average age of the first-time buyer is 34. renters, you were talking about renters, there are 25 inquiries for each vacant property in this country. And of course, we've got a rising population and increased household formation. So there is a housing crisis in this country that needs to be addressed. And it's not just a human issue, of course, it's an economic issue. Because if you don't have a supply of housing, you can't have a mobile labour force, which is absolutely essential for economic productivity and growth. And that's why I think it was so good today to hear about that Rebuilding Britain, that focus on economic growth, and housing has to be a central part of that mission going forward. And it didn't have to be like this, actually, because if the UK had built at the same level as the average European country, we would have today an additional 4.3 million homes. And the problem is, as you know, the successive governments have not met their housing targets. The current government has talked about 300,000 new homes a year. That's never been matched. And actually this year, I'm hearing that the figure might be 120,000. And if that is true, that will be the lowest figure since World War II. So clearly there's failure on delivering and building the homes that we need. And it comes down to really two things in my book. One is about vision, and the second is actually looking at the planning system. It's worth going back to 1945, because the Labour government recognised in 1945 that housing was going to be absolutely essential to get the economy moving. In 1946, they built 180,000 homes in that year alone. And over the course of the 6 years, they built 1 million homes. And in addition, 500,000 temporary homes as well, 1.5 million in a 6-year period. And what I think is important there is that political will to transform a situation. So you can't just leave this to market forces. So looking at the issue about the planning system, and you were saying about some detailed policies, well, we carry out a survey of our members, and they are the SME house builders. And they have been in marked decline over the last 40 years. In the late 1980s, they were 40% of all new homes were built by local house builders. Today, it is less than 10%. We've got to get SMEs back into the housing market if we're going to build the number of homes that are required. And that means actually looking at the planning system. It means access to land. A lot of small builders cannot find the small parcels of land that they need to build on. And that means looking at the local plans. And it was good that Angela was talking about the need to force local authorities to produce their local plans. Only 40% of local plans have been produced. And that gives a remit really to stop development taking place. We've got the issue about planning departments under-resourced, and that causes delays and costs for those wanting to build, particularly smaller house builders. The Green Belt. It's encouraging, I think, to hear statements about reviewing the Green Belt, because it's not, as people think it is, lush green land. Often it's scrub land which we've better built on to meet the needs of our growing population. And of course, community engagement. We need better community engagement to overcome the NIMBYs across the country. And that means probably better designed houses, better choice, not the identikit housing that we've seen being built all across the country. And the two other things I just want to pick on, it's not just about new homes, it is about existing homes. And Sandy was talking about the need for a national retrofit strategy. 85% of our homes will still be in use in 2050. We've got to make sure those homes are fit for purpose. We need to tackle fuel poverty, we need to upgrade those homes. And actually, it's very encouraging about 19 million homes being retrofitted over a 10-year period. But to do that, you do need installers and builders to do the work. And my concern about that policy is actually, is the Labour Party really thinking hard enough about who's going to do the work and to what standard? Given that I've said at the beginning, anyone can call themselves a builder. So as part of today's discussion, I hope we will touch on standards and qualifications in the building industry to retrofit those homes. But I think what an exciting time to be talking about housing, and I'm greatly encouraged that actually this will be a central theme going into the general election.
Super, Brian. Thank you. And I'll just pass over to Sharma to close out this part of our hour together. Sharma's obviously been at the coalface, so looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. And what I find really heartening is that housing is talked about so much at Labour conference. Last week, in stark contrast, the Conservative conference, I don't think mentioned housing once, and you think they were supposed to be the party of home ownership, and not once was it discussed on the main stage. I'm not sure if any fringes were discussed about it. I think it was more about whether Liz Truss or Nigel Farage was going to be involved in what was happening in the Conservatives. So I suppose my angle on this, and I've been doing this regen planning role for 7 years. I was a teacher before that, and I know the impact of poor housing and housing insecurity can have on life chances. And my firm belief, and we have this in Brent as our administration, that it's not just a legal, political, economic obligation, it's a moral obligation that we provide housing and homes for our communities and the homes that they require, not just for families, for older people who might need extra care type of housing. So, it's a moral duty, it's a dereliction of our duty of political leaders if we don't follow this through. Now in Brent, I'm proud to say that we are actively open for development. We actively encourage house building, not just our own programme. We've got an actively large council house building programme, but also working in partnership with developers of all sizes to work and build in our borough. And just to talk about SME builders, my dad's an SME builder, has been for 30 years. My brother's now taking over the business, and so I was imagining that I'd be a teacher for the rest of my life and not join the family business, and here I am in politics joining the family business. So in Brent, some of the things that we've done to enable us to kind of be really pro-housing, we've been awarded this year the highest new homes bonus in the country. So we are developing and building more than anybody else in the country, and we're punching well above our weight, and that's just not just social council housing, but all tenures of housing. We are very mindful that some of the things that make Brent successful in terms of housing delivery is a political direction and political will. We are very clear with our officers, with our group, with our residents, and with the industry about what we want in terms of direction of housing. And so we have those partnerships with developers and the industry about what we want. And actually, we welcome small and large developers to say, what are you going to do to invest in our communities? It's going to be a two-way partnership, because we know that we don't own all the land in the borough. Secondly, our planning department and planning service is geared up for that endeavour. We have made the political decision not to cut our planning service in time of austerity. We have some vacancies now because that's the sector as it is, that we can't fill the vacancies, and particularly post-COVID it's been a bit harder. Particularly building regs, it's been hard to recruit to. We're now embarking on programmes of apprenticeships and graduate apprenticeships where we're asking architects to retrain and come into work as planners, and we're seeing that as coming to fruition. In addition to that, our planning service has changed in the approach to the process. So we have a very established and very strong pre-app service. So we actively say we will not put things forward to committee until it's ready to be approved. Our planning committee actively look reasons to say no. They actually want to approve housing in our planning committee, and our chair of planning actually at the beginning of every committee will say, it's our moral obligation and our duty to deliver housing, and Brent will play its part. The other things that we actively do is encourage the communities to get involved in the planning process or the planning policy process. Now, I'm not one of those, I'm very much a YIMBY, I want to see housing built. But I also want to make sure the tweaks in the planning system reflect democratic voice and the voice of the community. And what I want to see come forward, and what we've done in Brent, is how you enable that community voice to be heard in the built environment of any community. So we have our local plan that we adopted last year. It's the most recent one. It runs in parallel with the regional London plan. It's now been recognised by the RTPI as the best plan in London, and hopefully in the country when it goes forward this soon in the RTPI awards. But what it's meant our officers to do is we become the master planner in our growth areas. So we've dedicated areas in so if you know Brent, Neasden, Wembley, Kilburn, we have actively created master plans to say, this is what, to the industry, small or large, this is what we want. And we have sites across the borough that could be small or large that we would showcase what we think can be delivered on that site. We will actively help and support developers with our CPO powers to enable and facilitate housing to come forward. And we have done in a number of occasions to make sure that happens. But to give you a context, we were going really, really well. We were reducing our temporary accommodation lists, and pre the Kwarteng budget and post Kwarteng budget, we now have on average 150 families come to us every week, declaring themselves homeless, and that's not sustainable because for the first time in years, we are now actively having to send families out of London in B&Bs and hotels, not just housing, but just B&B and hotels. And the knock-on effect of that is not just economic and the impact on the family themselves, because that's hugely a big upheaval, is it changes the nature of our communities within Brent. We're actively seeing councils across London talking about closures of primary schools. We are actually having such few children coming to our primary school sector that there are conversations about closing primary schools. And that's not what you want to see for a thriving community in a thriving city. So in terms of delivery for house building in Brent, I do agree. I believe in a plan-led system, and I think in Brent we've demonstrated that plan-led system can work. We've embarked on Article 4 directions to stop office to resi conversions without being plan-led because we're worried about the loss of office space, but also the quality of housing that results from permitted development. But what I do want to see is a nod or a kind of push towards if an application, large or small, meets policy, it shouldn't be subjected to a further possibility that it gets refused, especially if the policy has been democratically elected or implemented or founded. There absolutely needs a workforce strategy, not just in terms of skills in the construction sector. Some of our big developers in Brent have seen a third of their workforce leave the sector, whether it's through Brexit or whether it's through other career choices. And that's one issue. But there absolutely needs to be a conversation about workforce planning for local government, particularly in the planning sector. There needs to be a conversation about public borrowing, the Public Works Loan Board. There needs to be a conversation about interest rates. We can't borrow at the moment, and for small or large sites, and we actively take small sites and support SMEs in Brent, but at the moment borrowing is expensive. So the government had the lever to say if you're going to be building homes, pause borrowing or pause interest rates. I personally think one of our biggest concerns residents have when we come to house building, whether it's large or small, is the impact on social amenities and infrastructure. Even in London, where we've got great transport links, people worried about impact on parking, school places, GP surgeries. So if we're going to have housing targets and a planning service that's more flexible to enable housing to come forward, there needs to be a conversation about infrastructure and how we support that and push other public sector bodies, whether it's health, whether it's transport, whether it's any of the other services, how they're going to make sure that they deliver the required facilities needed. And finally, I think, and it's a conversation about potentially the green belt, and in Brent we don't have any green belt, we're a landlocked borough in London, but we have metropolitan open land that's protected, and I do want to see green space protected and used. But what the conversation needs to be about is not just about green belt and green space, it's about how we use land in this country. And my wish, and I've said this to Matthew Pennycook and the Shadow DLUC team, is actually, why don't we have a land use audit? We need to understand what land can be used for housing, what land needs to be used for green space, for industry, for agriculture, for infrastructure. And actually that sends if we're able to do that, then we're able to send a message to the market, to the councils, say this is what we want to see our land to be used for. And then we give certainty to our communities because they know what's coming. So that would be my ask. And the final ask, and I've said this to every panel, I've spoken on 7 panels over the last 2 days, is fix local government, because we are on our knees. The 150 families that we get every week coming to us at temporary accommodation at the moment, we're projected to cost Brent alone £13 million extra this year in cost to our revenue budget. And a council where we've lost over 200 million since 2010 of austerity, we are struggling. We are on our knees. I oversee the finance brief in Brent. We've had to put, for the first time in years, expenditure controls on our services in Brent. And that doesn't just mean the nice-to-haves. We won't be having any nice-to-haves. That's gone a long time ago. It will be just the bare minimum. Any changes to public environment, bin services are going to change. And this is not just me in Brent. This is every local government authority. So my big ask is, if we need to get house building sorted, fix local government, because that's how we know what we need for our communities, but we need the capacity and the resource to do so.
Thanks, Sharma. So many ideas from the four panellists, and let's get straight into them. The first question I'm going to pose, I think I'll pose it to Brian and Sandy, actually. And it's a question I've asked a version of in all the events I've done on housing recently. But I think under what everyone has said is a recognition that this is a very, very long-term problem. You could say that it goes back to the 80s. It was probably the last time we built, before the 80s, when we built social housing in significant numbers. You might say it goes back to the 40s, when the planning system that we have now is introduced. You might go back to the 20s and the 30s, when actually we last built the highest rates of new private housing per annum. So given that this is a really long problem that's bedeviled governments of different stripes and different parties, how confident, how optimistic you are that Labour has what it takes to grasp the nettle and do something that has troubled governments in the past. So, Brian, I'll go to you first and then I'll go to Sandy.
Yeah, well, I think going back to what I said earlier, I mean, when a government is absolutely committed to achieving a public policy, it can do it. And it did it in 1946 and then in that post-war period, because there was a necessity to build homes for the country during a time when there was a skill shortage, when a time when they couldn't find all the materials. So it can be done. It's about putting the political will into delivering that. The issue, I think, over more recent years has been, obviously, the private sector output has remained largely the same. It has been the reduction in affordable housing. And we saw that from the 1980s onwards, really, where we saw the sell-off of a lot of social housing. And the problem, of course, is not replacing that stock. That was the fundamental problem. So I'm very concerned that actually it's great to be building more affordable housing and social housing, but the social housing, let's keep it there, because we need a stock that is available to people at the start of their lives or at any part of their lives when they need low-cost, decent homes.
Yeah, we'll come back to that actually as well in a bit. Sandy, anything to add?
I think it is such a critical issue that the Labour Party has no choice but to take real issue. I think this really is a tipping point. Your 150 families a week, for example, the realisation that it was such an extraordinary error to allow right to buy but prevent that revenue to create more of the same that was a proven success. Every time I think about that, I just can't believe that it was such a fundamental error. But it's interesting that there has been a statement in the last week saying, and when we do this again, we will guarantee that 100% of it will be put into housing. So the penny has dropped rather too late. So I think it is such a serious situation we're in. There is an obligation to do something. I would be surprised. I think something has to happen. And I take the point about community pressure. I think it would be helpful if we could find a way to encourage people to take the action that puts the pressure on. And I was involved in something in Greenwich some years ago when there was derelict land, and a group of residents, us, a small group, said, we can do something with this. And we did it with local labour work-ins. We employed long-term unemployed people. And it was so lovely, the council decided to properly develop it, and we ended up with a mixed development. But it was driven by individuals saying, we are going to do something. And I think there can be a lot of influence that way.
Dan, I should say hello. Dan Norris is the Metro Mayor for the West of England. I'll let you have a breather before I call upon you to say anything.
I'm either very late or extremely early for next year. You'll make up your own mind.
I'll give you a moment to catch your breath. Anya, I have a question for you. It seems like there's consensus here that planning reform is going to be part of whatever strategy Labour comes up with to tackling the housing crisis, and there are positive things, positive noises coming from the leadership. So my question to you is this. Do we need to rip up and start again, or can we get the things that we need out of the planning system, most importantly greater certainty, both for developers and communities, through the existing system and just making it work better?
Well, I don't know if you remember, I'm sure you do, a few years ago government did try to rip up the planning system and start again. And it, got battered back into oblivion by their own party members. Labour is not necessarily subject to the same challenges, right? That was very specifically a group of MPs who were representing constituencies with, very reluctant to build outside of major cities. Labour doesn't necessarily have that same internal group of opposition, so they may be able to be more ambitious than the Tories were, just on a purely political basis within their own party. What I would say, though, is governments have been trying to do this for a very long time now. We're all, I think there's a fairly strong consensus that the planning system is not working. It never has been working. It's pretty dire. We know why. We know how it gives vetoes to opposition. We know how it doesn't factor in the voices of renters who might not necessarily live in the area for a very long time, but they still need housing. They still need to move to areas for work and so on. So I don't know. I think Labour can probably be more ambitious, but I also think there is a lot of scope within the planning system, without necessarily changing the whole thing, to improve it, to improve the set of incentives that participants in that planning system face. I mean, you can do all sorts of things from. There are proposals like street votes, which is in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, the idea that you give communities the ability to approve housing in their area. Many of them may not want to use it, but some of them will. And you've kind of got a free, publicly agreeable way of doing so. There are things that you can do, I think, in the consultation process to actually ensure that you are not just listening to a very small minority of unrepresentative voices who are always there saying no, whatever it is, and ignoring renters who actually overwhelmingly are in favour of new housing in their area because they rightly understand that they are the people that is potentially going to live in it. So I think, I don't know what I would do in Labour position. I think that's a political matter that I am very grateful I don't have to decide over. But you can do a lot of things within the current system. You can also reform the system entirely. Honestly, I'm happy with either of them, but you just need to be prepared that you're going to have to adopt a different strategy. If you are going to reform the whole system, you're going to expect to have the battle of your life over it. And good luck to them if they do.
Yeah, I should say, as a bit of advertising for Policy Exchange, the Street Votes proposal is a Policy Exchange policy. Sharma, I'm going to ask you a quick question, then I'll give Dan a chance to say a few words, and then we'll go to the audience. I just want to pick up on one of the things you were sort of remarking on, which is it's a question of whether we should just care about quantity in the aggregate, and that's it, or whether we should think more closely about tenure types. Would you like a Labour housing policy that was committed to changing the ratio, for example, of social housing to private rented to owner occupancy? Do you think that's something we should be worrying about, or is it simply about getting aggregate increases in supply into the system?
I think the way that I would address this conversation is really about enabling what the key outcome is here, or what do we need to think about, what do we need to achieve by any policy change or ratios and stuff. And in Brent we have a 50% target on affordable housing, but rarely gets met because of viability. So we break down the affordable housing 70-30 split, and we generally get it because we push and negotiate and so on. My personal belief is that housing security should be is a fundamental right, and it's about aspiration. And actually, the most simple way I can put it is that my 14-year-old daughter, in 10 years' time, like I did, she'd be able to get a mortgage if she wants to, or if she wants to rent, she should be able to. And the key thing is about supply. We absolutely need social housing, but the people that are coming through our doors, those 150 families, weren't families that were on a social housing ladder. There were people that were priced out because interest rates went up and mortgages were going through the roof and landlords were exiting the market. So these people who had been able to afford things. And you speak to any family, what they want for their children is, actually, they want them to have a good job and to be secure in their housing. Home ownership is absolutely part of that. So my view is actually it's not about numbers and ratios, and actually we should be looking at not just affordable housing as a tenure, but extra care living. What do we need for the care sector? Because that's actually absolutely needed. And you could have any kind of ratios, but nothing's going to get done if we don't address supply in the round. And so my view is we address supply, we then bring down prices, and then it becomes a choice for our residents, because that's what meritocracy and aspiration is around choice, isn't it? And if our young people are saying, I've done everything I can, I went to school, went to university, I got a good career, or I've done this course and I'm now done an apprenticeship, I'm earning good money, but I still can't afford to live where I want to live, that's not a good outcome. So we should be looking at aspiration and actually increasing supply in the round.
Yeah, it's interesting. It came up on a panel earlier, and we were talking about the fact that in the last Labour government, the idea of making choice something that's available to everyone, not just the well-heeled, is a really important idea, particularly for the Labour Party. Dan, why don't you tell us why the Metro Mayor / Combined Authorities model is the panacea to all of this?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, apologies for not being here on time. And can I start by saying, look, I have to do my job or I get told off because people watch these things, would you believe, and record them. What I need to say is, look, the area I represent is Bristol and Bath, the World Heritage City, and many of the areas around. Beautiful, very beautiful countryside. Home to J.K. Rowling, who I actually went to school with. Also the birthplace of Mary Berry, who I didn't go to school with. And maybe I went to school with Banksy, but I wouldn't know. So who can tell? But please do come to the region and spend lots of money. Now I've done my job, I can answer your question. Okay. Look, I think that there are all sorts of challenges about combined authorities and metro mayors because we're different, and therein lies their strength and their weakness. And I suppose what I'd simply say is that one of the things that I'm asking potential Labour ministers in a future Labour government, of course, is to make sure that when they send resources to combined authorities, they actually send them to the metro mayors rather than the combined authorities. Now, that might sound like an odd distinction, but if you're Andy Burnham or Steve Rotherham or many of my other great comrades who are metro mayors, sending it to the combined authority isn't a problem because it's a Labour majority. The councils that make it up are Labour mainly. But where I am, I'm effectively in a marginal seat. I had a Tory and a Liberal Democrat council leader, as well as a Labour one. And a lot of the votes that I have to get through need to be unanimous, would you believe? So, for example, last year I had something called the Spatial Development Plan, which was to plan housing for the next 25 years, as well as jobs and infrastructure. And one of the leaders voted against it. Guess which party? The Tory party. And because of that, that's all been put on ice now. So what I'm asking a future Labour government to do is whatever resources they give, whatever Rachel Reeves allows, please send it to me as a Labour Metro Mayor, not to my combined authority. Because otherwise you end up getting bogged down in the awful rules that the government use to create the constitutions of combined authorities. Because basically they bribe local authorities with lots of money, provided they could get them over the line. And in return, the combined authority, the councils, especially when they weren't Labour, wanted to make sure that a very strong Labour in Bristol didn't dominate the scene. So we have to box very clever when it comes to the politics of this. And look, where I'm able to do things, it's fantastic. Being in power beats being in opposition. I can assure you it's absolutely fantastic. But if it's limited by the rules and the processes, Labour needs to change that, because what I want to do is have the option to make my region so good under Labour control that people will vote Labour, and then we have all Labour councils anyway. But we've got to get there first. And then the other thing I want to say, because I'm not sure what you've spoken about, that's one of the disadvantages of not being here, of course, but I want to talk a little bit about the Green Belt, because I know Labour's talking a lot, quite rightly, about the need to build new homes and the possible impact that will have on the Green Belt. And I want to wake some of you up, because I can see some of you are a bit tired, so I'm going to give you a visual test. So I'm going to show you something. I hope you can see it. Okay, I want you to look at that. That is something called the Almondsbury Interchange. That is where the M4 and the M5 intersect. Just above the M32, for those of you who know the motorway going straight into the heart of Bristol. Okay, that very beautiful landscape there. And that there is me standing in a place called Timsbury, which is in northeast Somerset, which is part of the West of England area that I'm proud to represent and that grew up in. And I want to tell you that that one is Green Belt, okay? And that one isn't. And the reason I'm showing you that is because I think Green Belt stuff is very sensitive. We have to be sensitive to that fact, because we will be giving the Tories an open goal if we're not skillful in how we handle development on the Green Belt. Now, my view is we should be pledging to not decrease the area of the Green Belt in any given area. So, for example, you could declassify this, which clearly doesn't need protecting anymore because it's been eroded since 1948 by the building of motorways, etc. And this, which is beautiful and irreplaceable, isn't protected and should be made protected. If we do that, we will not be open to the inevitable Tory attacks of we are undermining the Green Belt, which will resonate particularly in some of the semi-rural areas where we need to win Labour MPs, actually. So we've got to be smart about this, because the Tories are going to use lots of dog whistle strategies. We see it with, stop the boats and all the rest of it, and they'll definitely do it on the Green Belt, because surprisingly, people care about the countryside even when they live right in the most urban of areas. It's a very emotive thing. And my judgment, for what it's worth, is that's become even more so since the pandemic, where people appreciated going outside, getting a walk, fresh air, beautiful trees. And so we've got to be really careful, because it's an emotional appeal, and we mustn't let the emotions of the electorate stop us achieving a Labour government. I think I've said enough.
Very interesting indeed, Dan. Thank you for being with us. I should get out to the audience now. Just pop your hand in the air if you've got a question. No question too outrageous. Just name an organisation first. The first hand was just here in between the middle of the three. And then let's do you three guys, if that's all right. So the lady at the front, the lady behind, and the gentleman behind that. And then I'll come to you, sir, afterwards, and at the back as well.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Emma Tasker, I work in Beaton Place, which is a business of crafting a positive narrative about new development.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we do involves liaising with politicians and the community and whatnot. There's been a lot of talk about the Green Belt, and that is something that we find really challenging as well, because people don't understand what Green Belt is. This is a question for all panellists. We think it needs a rebrand. We think it needs a new name. If you could give the Green Belt a new name, what would you?
Could we take them as a cluster, actually, if that's all right? I'll collect the questions and then we'll go through them. No microphone, I'm afraid. Your question.
So my name's Cedar, I'm from the Federation of Master Builders.
Hello.
34 years old, so the average age of first-time buyer. I've got two questions, I'll be really quick, I promise. If you want to get more first-time buyers onto the housing ladder, I can tell you now that many of my friends that were looking to buy a house really didn't want to buy a new home in a large development because of the quality.
Yep.
So I'd like to know how we're going to address that. And retrofit was mentioned at the very beginning, and it hasn't been mentioned again. How are we actually going to deliver the retrofit strategy that Labour have outlined? Fantastic strategy, but how are we going to do it?
Great questions.
Hi, I'm Nigel Young. I'm the councillor in London Borough of Barnet, Sharma's neighbour, and I'm the chair of the Strategic Planning Committee, and I'm also an architect. And we also, I think there is a value, I think, in local government. Myself, like probably many chairs up and down the country, I'm also a local councillor, so I also receive, every week I'll be receiving many letters from people who don't have a home. We have hotels full of refugees in the borough, so it's a problem we see from all sides. And I do have a worry that, I'm not a fan of the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework. I think that's clearly been proved to not be successful because it hasn't been. But I think if we just focus entirely, and I'm not suggesting we are, but if we focus very strongly on changing the planning system will solve our problems, I really think we're going down a bit of a dead end. We're just about to publish our local plan. There's going to be sites up to about 40,000 units to be delivered in 10 years. We've had a thorough look at all the, all the sites that are available. And we're regularly giving permissions, and we're regularly getting, petitions of 5,000 signatures against, So these are really, really difficult issues that planning committees have to resolve, and planners have to resolve. And I think that we will run a risk. I think if we push too hard, too much harder than where we are already, we won't be able to take people with us, and we will end up losing councils, I suspect. So I think it is an important issue that we need to address, and I think there is more than just the planning policy issue. We have often sites that get permission, and then the developer comes back for another permission, and then another permission. We have some sites where we've got 5 or 6 applications in a row, and they have got permission already, So there are lots of issues in there, and I think we need to realise that it's a very, very complex issue. And just to say, change the planning policy and everything will be fine, I really worry that that's just not going to do the job, I'm afraid.
Okay, great. Can I ask panelists a relatively quick response so we can get to the other questions as well? So let's just start with that first one, the green belt. I'll go from my left to my right. So, Brian.
Greenbelt, well, absolutely right. I think Dan gave a brilliant example of what the Greenbelt actually looks like in practice. I think Dan's suggestion about not actually diminishing the size of the green belt as it is absolutely right. So rather than a belt, it needs to be a bit more elastic. So I haven't thought of a creative name, but green space or something like that to capture answer the question you asked. Do you want me to answer the other questions?
No, we'll go through. Anya, a green space, is that going to move the dial?
I'm not the one to invent this, but others have proposed that the green belt be called what it literally is, urban containment zone. Now, that's probably why I'm not going to get a phone call from government asking for a new name for the green belt, but that's its purpose, right? Its purpose is not to be green, its purpose is not to be beautiful. We already have other designations. Its purpose is to stop cities growing, and that is obviously a disaster when you have a growing population, and the green belt boundaries were set in the 1930s.
Sandy.
No build belt.
No build belt.
I don't have a creative name, but I definitely want to remove the word belt because it just is a strangling city, it's strangling growth and it's strangling creativity. In West London, we have green belt in and around Heathrow, which is of no ecological value at all. And what I'd love to see is a conversation that actually in Brent, we have policies from the London Plan. This is we've got to invest and enable extra industrial growth. So why can't we have that industrial growth in and around that land around Heathrow where there's great transport connectivity that releases more brownfield sites for us to build residential homes. So get rid of the name belt is what I feel.
Dan?
I don't know, irreplaceable, protected, something like that. Something that makes people relate to it because it's an emotional response that people have. And if you ignore that, I think that's foolish.
I've got about a dozen here, and one of them was breathing space.
Yeah. Breathing space. Well, it's funny that you focus on the belt. I think the misnomer in the green belt is the green bit, surely. We don't have to respond to this, but it's the spaces that aren't really green at all, but are developable land near train stations or whatever. Anyway, for another time. So the question about getting quality. Anya, I might go to you first. Do we need more regulation to ensure that build quality is higher, or is it about reducing the costs of regulations, particularly on small builders, to mean they can spend more on better quality design?
I think that's one thing. So I think we know there's fairly strong evidence that smaller builders do tend to be better. The housing that they build is of higher quality. Those are also the builders that we tend to strangle out of the planning system by, making it extremely difficult, extremely expensive to go through that process. So that's one thing. I think a second thing is reforming leasehold. That makes it very hard for new buyers of new properties, especially in flats, to enforce their rights and to deal with issues. Thirdly, you can get away with providing rubbish if you are not competing for the sales, right? So we used to build much nicer housing prior to inventing this whole process of going through layers and layers of bureaucracy in order to get it. So increasing housing supply, I suspect, would do quite a lot to improve it. And I think that's the main three, I would say. There's probably others.
Yeah, Brian, what would your members say on that on this question?
Well, I know what they'd say. The housing market is broken. It's dominated by 8 major house builders, producing identikit housing, ruining market towns where there's no sense of space or community, executive homes wrapped around market towns where you need a car to get into the centre, a detachment from the core of the community. So the housing market needs to be opened up. You need more diversity and choice in the housing market, and that comes down to getting more local house builders delivering higher quality homes. And don't forget, actually, it is the small builders who actually train the apprentices. The vast majority of apprentices are trained by small local building companies, not by the major house builders or the larger contractors. That's why it's so good to actually spread this out across the country, because you're getting regional economic growth in every village, every town, and every city.
I can add something to that if you might
Please
let
do.
me come in here. We propose at the CIOB that one way of improving participation by SMEs would include revising land prices. so that the land is available at a more reasonable rate, therefore incentivising competition on quality and design rather than volume. So that is one way of doing it, and also addressing this issue of making small plots available. As Brian says, for the SMEs who employ locally, have an interest in community, build to a decent quality because they're local. And so that's one way of perhaps helping that.
Yeah, just very quickly on that. I mean, so just because I'm curious, do you think that comes through CPO reforms, or is that really again a planning issue? Because the cost of land is it's just crude rendering, but is inflated by the planning system because it constrains the supply of land that's permissionable considerably.
Yes, and I think this is an area where the collaboration that we are so engaged in with Brian, with the RTPI, with the RICS, is we are actually working together because it's in everybody's interest to sort out this stuff. So, yes, it's complicated, as somebody in the audience has said. It's very complex, which is why you have so many moving parts, and they all have to be competent. And on competency, having said we have a huge skill shortage, the good news as far as we're concerned is that our apprenticeships have really taken off, and we also have a new membership grade, which is Tech CIOB, which is allowing us to enter into our membership the other people in the supply chain, to embed that competency issue and say we are all committed to delivering to a level. So we are trying to address this, and although we have a shortage, some of the stuff is working.
And just very briefly, and then we'll do two more questions. Sharma and Dan, do you want to take that thorny question that was last? Is this just about planning, or do we need to go beyond planning in this conversation about how to deliver lots more housing?
I think there's elements, and I think we've shown this in Brent, that planning can work to deliver housing if all parts of the administration and political leadership, as well as the office leadership, understand that. And I think we've made structural changes. Our committee are really well tuned about really interrogating applications. Name check, my vice chair of the planning committee is here, who's brilliant, who understands, the committee understand about what we need to do in the planning system to enable it to happen. So we've made decisions in our constitution that enables only big strategic things to come to planning committee. The small stuff actually does through delegated authority, so that gets done quicker and through the system much easier. But I think beyond planning, there needs to be a real cultural shift about how we talk about housing and how we talk about where people live, where people work, how people choose to live their lives. And it's easy to talk about, the opportunities that new housing can bring on a very harsh kind of economic level, but actually what about the quality of life that new homes can build? And we have to talk about things in a way that it's about opportunity, it's about aspiration, it's about better public health. We don't talk about housing and public health enough, and it's how we talk about housing in a much better way. And the opportunity around growth and sustainability is there as well. We don't embrace new technologies when it comes to housing either. So there's opportunities around beyond planning that can enable house building to grow. But I do think there's an element of, if we work and tinker some of the system, I do think it's about tinkering some of the system. Some of the systems, even my planners get annoyed about the level of burden within the planning system, that they want to see things come to fruition much faster. So it's about making things that, what is planning meant to be? It's meant to be about changing and enabling people to live and work in an area. So that's where you need to come back down to.
Dan, anything brief to add just to Sharma there?
Just very briefly, whatever we decide to do, hopefully when we're in government and what we're deciding before, obviously, the election, we need to start a conversation from this point onwards and beyond the election, because I do think that it's hugely important. I mean, one of the interesting things when I was an MP, covering an area, a small area that I now represent as the regional mayor, was there's a town called Keynsham, which is developed, and people there were very keen to have new homes when they were built. But those same people, 15 years later, when new homes were proposed to be built beyond them, were the biggest opponents. And we have to get that sorted, because that's a very good way of illustrating the challenges that we've got, and we've got to get around that.
One actual concrete policy position that I think planning actually needs to look at, and we've tried elements of this in Brent, is whose voice are we listening to when it comes to planning committee and planning objections. It's very easy for those with housing security to object to something when the voices of those who don't have housing security aren't heard. So can we change the planning system to enable the voice of those without housing security be more powerful and have more weight in the planning system than those that do?
We have overrun, but I'm going to just take those last two questions. We'll do them really quickly, and I'll ask for clip responses and summations as we come to the end of the event. So just at the back there, and there was that gentleman at the back there actually had his hand up.
Hi there. I had a question. It's kind of related to Europe. So the decoupling of wage growth and house price growth isn't unique to the UK, but it appears that it's more severely seen here. And it's whether, what are the key insights from our European neighbours about how they've managed to not have the same decoupling that we've seemed to experience? If there's a key insight.
That question there.
Thank you, Chair. Sharwan Choudhury, councillor from Croydon, and also worked for social housing for the last 27 years. Well, I think I agree with everybody. When you think about new housing, you need to be infrastructure ready, like suppose transport and clinic and whatever it is. The main issue is how we are going to build new housing. But in future government, Labour government, I think we need to look at different ways, which is social housing, not affordable housing. Because if you want to transfer ordinary working, hard-working people's life, you need a social housing, simple as that, which is a lot of local authority have some cluster of land they can build on, or even we have to work with housing association. Because without them, you can make 10,000 properties, but all our private sector, 30% social housing, it cannot solve the problem.
Super.
But we need 100% social housing by local authority or social housing.
Right.
RSL.
Super. I'm going to take your question, and I'll give you an opportunity to answer all the questions and then sum up at the same time. I'm sure it'll be easy. Just this gentleman here. Yeah, this gentleman here, yeah.
Thank you. I'll make it Peter McDermott, University of Salford. So very close to what Brian and Sandy are talking about. But it's a question for you, or a comment for you. Your skills of political economy are really needed in the debate that we should be having, in addition to housing, about the state and nature of the construction sector. I think Labour can do a lot more when it comes in, and sorry, Sandy wasn't there this morning, but the coming together with the Construction Leadership Council, that's where we can really need some political economy to bring about change in our construction sector. It's a parallel question. I think your skills are needed, political economy.
James, can I quickly come in? Because I think this person asked about retrofit, and I just want to answer your question, because that's hugely important.
Go for it.
We need to work really hard on that, but the true answer is we've got to train people up to do retrofitting, because even if we wanted to do it, we haven't got the skilled people, and that answers your question, sir, because as a Metro Mayor, one of my big jobs is getting the skilled workforce so that we can do all these exciting things.
Super. I'll go from right to left. Sharma, concluding remarks.
Learnings from the European neighbours. I think one of the things, interestingly, about European neighbours, and one of the things I see coming forward, which I wish we'd had a bit of a culture of this, is the idea of gentle density, particularly in our urban areas. A lot of the objections we get in planning in Brent is sometimes we go very high, to 25 plus story buildings in Brent, particularly around Wembley Stadium and so on. And actually, if we'd been braver earlier about learning about how Paris and some of the big cities in Europe look at gentle density, so having 5-6 stories in some of our urban areas rather than the 2-story 1930s sort of Metroland piece, we wouldn't be needing some of the higher tower blocks. And actually, the kind of cultural shift is very different. And how they also, European neighbours, look at renting, home ownership isn't the be-all and end-all, but they have some real great guarantees around rental and so on. So there are some things that we can take from our European neighbours. Social housing, grants. We cannot do anything without grants. We have a big programme in Brent with our council housing programme. We were on course to deliver over 1,000. Difficulty we've got now, interest rates has meant that viability has shown a gap in some of our schemes to £20 million on some of our schemes. That's just unsustainable. So we've had to pause some of our council and social housing schemes. So grant systems for social housing is really, really important. Retrofitting, I think my final summation for all of this, any policy on housing, any policy on planning cannot work if you don't resource local government properly. It cannot work, even the skills agenda cannot work without local input done properly. So my ask to Labour politicians or Labour parliamentarians, to mayors, is to say, fund local government properly and fight for local government, because without us, nothing's going to get built.
Thanks, Sharma. Sandy, concluding remarks.
Right, Europe. We haven't cracked the whole concept of grand projet. We don't do big stuff very well. And picking up your point, there's a totally different attitude to what it means by owning a home. But finally on that, I always find it fascinating when you look at developments, how cleverly they are genuinely mixed living. And the houses are designed so you don't have this thing about, well, we'll do a bit of Section 106 on the other side of the road where nobody can see it and they won't have a car parking space. It seems far more democratic. I'd like to throw in something positive on this, which I forgot to mention. One of the other things we feel will make a difference at CIOB to get retrofit, apart from, you're quite right, we need the skills, so we're on to that. Interest-free loans for homeowners so they can make a decent job of what they need to do to retrofit with the information that will enable them to make an informed decision. It's difficult, it's cloudy, you might get ripped off, so we need information and we need interest-free loans.
Thanks, Sandy. Anya.
Thank you for asking about Europe, because I have been screaming for years that we just need to look at other countries to find out why our system is not working to the same level. There's three things that just off the top of my head I thought. Well, firstly, they have very different incentives for their planning authorities. Local governments tend to take the tax receipts from new development, and therefore they tend to like new development. In fact, they tend to love it. So they build a lot more in the places where that is the case. They have rules-based systems. They do not have discretionary systems where councillors argue over every single development in the country. They decide what they want and where they want it, and then you are allowed to build it as long as it meets those requirements. Thirdly, they tend to make decisions at a regional level as opposed to a very local level, which means that they are able to integrate those decisions with infrastructure and other things, and they are less linked to, hyper-local battles. On the point about social housing, yes, but we also have to recognise that most people want to own their home, and they're not unreasonable for wanting to do that. Most people don't want to be renters for all their lives. I certainly don't. I may be, who knows. They want to own their homes, and if Labour is to succeed in government, it has to give people the lives they are dreaming, right? It has to provide what people want as well. So we do need a mix of tenures. But it's very easy to deliver that as part of a package. In fact, you build out faster if you do have a mix of tenures.
Thank you, Anya. And finally, Brian, the big reveal, you're going to tell us what the correct answers are.
Well, I think we're learning from our European neighbours. In this country, of course, it has been the ambition for most people to own their own home. There's an obsession about investing in homes, which I think has distorted the market. They're not seeing as homes, they are a key investment. So I think there is something to be learnt from our European neighbours, particularly on the private renter sector, where here it's either very expensive or very poor quality, whereas actually I lived in Belgium and rented a flat in the centre of Brussels, absolutely lovely, at a reasonable price. We need to be thinking along those lines as well. Social housing, we do need more social housing. But as I said earlier, a future Labour government will need to invest and spend the money and treat it as a major infrastructure project, because we've not had the level of social housing building since the early 1980s. That comes at a cost. So let's protect it and preserve it. And one of the dangers, I think, of the right to buy policy was actually the social housing that's been left created sink estates and the stigma of living in social housing. That needs to be removed. My grandparents lived in a council house. They were very proud of it. And there were people who worked full time. They took pride in it. There's been a polarisation in social housing. It should be open to people of all different backgrounds to live in social housing. We need to remove that stigma, and that's what's set in over the last 40 years. And then on retrofitting, of course, it's not just one thing. The whole thing about retrofit to work properly is that consumers need better information about what they can have done to their properties. We need to upskill the workforce to make sure they're competent to do the work. There needs to be the right standards which are approved by the financial lenders. And then the supply chain needs to be equipped to be able to have the certainty to deliver the materials that are going to be needed to retrofit 29 million homes in this country.
Brilliant, thanks, Byron. Three very quick thank yous to finish up. Oscar Bickett, a thank you to you for letting me overrun again. This is the second time today. Thank you very much. To the CIOB and the Federation of Master Builders who have kindly sponsored this event. And finally, to our fantastic panel, can you join me in giving a round of applause?